a good one to start. So I would like to introduce to you the two facilitators who will be leading us in this discussion. The first one is Dr. Sherry Frazier, who is the Provost Emerita and Professor of Social Work at Concordia College in Bronxville, where she served for 36 years and just retired in June. After graduating from college, Sherry accepted a social work position at Gary Neighborhood Services in Gary, Indiana, and she notes that her experiences in Gary provided the most meaningful education she's received thus far. Dr. Frazier's 3 children attended Tuckahoe schools from kindergarten through grade 12 and graduated from Tuckahoe High School, all 3 of them. The next facilitator is Dr. Michael Gerald, Reverend Dr. Michael Gerald, who is a graduate of Trenton State College and Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Gerald has a doctorate degree from Eastern University's Palmer Theological Seminary in the area of Psychology of Leadership Renewal. He formerly served as a law enforcement executive and is now the senior pastor of Shiloh Baptist Church, where he resides with his family. So welcome and thank you to the 2 facilitators who were so generous to give of their time and of their knowledge and their insights into this broad discussion. I do want to go over a few housekeeping things. So the first one is that I'd like to ask everyone to please mute your phones until you're called to speak. When you want to ask a question, you can ask a question by either raising your hand, and you can do that by going to the participants button and then go to more, and you can raise your hand there. If you would like to type a question in the chat bar and I would read it for you, you may do that also for those of you who are a little more shy and don't want to speak in public. Just to keep you up to date, this week we're going to be reading or going over chapters 4, 5, and 6. We're coming together every Thursday until September 3rd. So we have 2 more Thursdays from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. And so we ask that you join us as often as you can. For those of you who can attend all, that would be great. Let's see, I think that's it. I want to acknowledge a few elected officials that joined us. Trustee Renee Howell is with us. She was here last week and she's joined us again. Thank you, Trustee Howell. And also we have Trustee Gina Lee, who's also with us today. So thank you both. I don't know if there's anyone else on the board with us that I'm not seeing. Okay, so thank you. And so that we can have enough time for discussion and dialogue, I'm going to turn it over to you two. Thank you.
So I don't know, Dr. Frazier, do you want me to begin or you want to begin?
Well, you're certainly welcome to begin. I think I kind of monopolized our first session, and this will be more dialogue back and forth. So go right ahead, sir.
So welcome everyone, and thank you again for indulging us in this discussion, allowing us to be a part of it. So last week we began with the forward through about chapter 3, and so the writer conceptualizes this term called white fragility to describe activities that she's observed through her practice of being a racial sort of coach or trainer. And she says that the tenets of white fragility are triggered through discomfort and anxiety whenever white people's identity as good, moral folks is challenged, and it leads to a posture of defensiveness. And she says that it also contains elements of emotional responses: anger, fear, guilt, silence, argumentation, and withdrawal. And she finds that these sorts of emotions soothes and reinstates equilibrium to repel a challenge and restore racial comfort. So these are some of the tenets of what she describes as white fragility. And you could find that information on page 2 in the introduction. So she really lays out sort of like a multi-layered definition of what she's talking about in her work. And she goes about trying to explain that throughout the course of the rest of her work. So now, when we reach chapter 4, this chapter is really one that I particularly found interesting. This chapter of belonging. And whenever I think of this sort of topic over the course of my life and my experiences, I know that on many occasions, I've been the only minority in a sea of white folks. And when she talked about belonging, it sort of brought up in my experience and my experiences those times when I was the only one. And I don't know if any of you have ever felt that sense of being the only one, but it is a jarring kind of experience. It's an experience where you don't feel affirmed. You don't feel like you matter. You don't feel like your felt needs are being met. You don't feel like you're even, you know that you're being seen because, eyes, are on you, but you're not, sometimes you're not welcomed into certain conversations. And so just to throw that out there, I don't know if anyone has ever felt like that, like they were all alone in a sea of other people that were strange to them. Anybody?
Yeah, so hi, Michael, it's Renee. I can tell you 2 times in my life when that's happened. Once, I was running a lab in Maryland and I had a person in my group who happened to be Black, and her mother passed away, so I went to the funeral. And it was in a church in DC, and it happened to be, predominantly Black neighborhood. And I walked into this church and there were literally hundreds of people there. She was a very well-known woman in the community. And it was a very surreal moment to look up and look around. And I was like one of 2 white people in hundreds of Black people. And my first thought was like, oh, so this is what it feels like when you're different, looking different. And the second time I had that experience was when I went to Africa. So it's also a really interesting thing to put yourself into a place where, that first, we're very visual creatures, so you recognize that immediately, right? I wasn't frightened, but I did feel that ping of being like alone, like you're different from the group. So that was my experience in that.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, it's pretty jarring to be the only one, and it really emphasizes how race does shape how we live and how we show up and what things make us comfortable, what things we are able to enjoy as a result. And so this whole notion of belonging also takes me back to a book that I've read called The Search to Belong. And in this book, the author describes how, groups are formed based upon commonality. And oftentimes, folks are not able to join groups because there's no real commonality there. And so in this text, the writer talks about how she's always felt this sense of belonging. She belonged, before she was born, she says, she knew she belonged. She belonged to a racial a group. And she said that she makes the statement that, if it weren't the case, perhaps she would not have been able to even be born in a particular hospital. So there's a lot of factors that belonging affords one who is the right, hue. And some people are restricted from accessing even medical helps and even other types of help. So this notion of belonging, I think, is a sociological fact that that is present within this relationship between Blacks and whites and other minorities. And I found it striking when she mentioned the whole notion of Rihanna's cosmetic line, and how, you know, minority women, you know, really were overjoyed at the mentioning of this new cosmetic line that was, you know, made exclusively or primarily for women of color. And she said, you know, she never had to you know, be as exuberant and as happy, because she's always felt like there were products that were made especially for her and her people. She said, you know, whenever she sees the most beautiful people, she always feels a sense of belonging even to that. So there's a lot of, you know, psychological reaffirmation that happens when you have this whole experience of belonging to this group. And so, you know, we see that even as, and I don't know, Dr. Frazier, maybe you can speak to this in terms of your college, and how, you know, sometimes minority children are less than, you know, happy about, you know, volunteering or joining certain clubs or groups.
It's you know, it's an interesting dynamic, and again, I wish I could tell you I understand what it is. I don't know if it's the level of diversity that exists on the campus at Concordia, and that's, you know, race, gender, and national origin, that it is such a diverse community that I think people feel at home, because there isn't any one, and I'll say this, dominant group. Our faculty is diverse, our administration is diverse, and our student body has been, and it's become more and more so, I would say probably in the last 15 years, as higher education has also changed. But I think the kind of going back to that question of that belonging, it's interesting at different ages and stages in our life where that is more critical and more important to us, and how we feel it in a different kind of way. Obviously, young people want to belong, and whether that's through athletics, or it's through clubs, or it's through points of interest. And then, you know, as we grow, that changes. And in some ways it becomes very separate or segregated, because our likes and our dislikes have a lot to do with who we are, where we come from, and, you know, where we're going. And whether that's intentional or not, I think it's a level of comfort versus discomfort. Do I belong here? Is this where I'm going to be welcome? And it's a normal human reaction to avoid places where we feel like we're not welcome, and kind of moving in a direction where there is acceptance, and a level of growth that can take place emotionally and physically and spiritually with whatever the group is that you're engaged with. And that can be a variety of groups. We have a reading group at the library that's reading a book. That population of people can be relatively diverse, but the common focus of what they're attending to brings them together. And this idea, there was a question left over from last week about, is racism a structure or is it an event? And I think that's part of what we're talking about right now, is that it really can be either. I think that if you don't belong, or you feel left out, or you feel in some way pushed out, that is an event that one does then feel like they've been targeted or eliminated from an opportunity. But there are also other kinds of events, such as this, where, we're talking about, some really sensitive topics and being very honest about it and open, so that there is an opportunity to really understand the concept of, duality in skin color, and what does that mean, and how do we understand that? And quite honestly, I think we're human. We're never going to figure it out. We're just going to try to keep getting better at being good people who care about one another. I'll stop there.
So there's a question. Why is it important for white people to understand that belonging is a key factor? And the question stopped. So I'm assuming that they're saying it's a key factor in how Black people are impacted in our society.
Right. And I think why is it important? Because we are human beings, or we all have, aside from probably skin pigmentation, there isn't much that's different about us. We are all the same. Our bodies are the same, and how we learn is very similar. I think that the thing there becomes, it kind of ties in with this question of being colorblind. We're all the same, doesn't matter what we look like, where we came from, what color, black, white, green, yellow. And for me, I think what that gets to the heart of is understanding who a person is as an individual, as a person, and that we can transcend poverty or geography or language or race, ethnicity. All of those things are part of who someone is. And that's not an event. That is a journey. That is something that is part of who we are. And if the word structure is the word that was used with the person that asked the question, I think it is about that structure and how we understand it and how we move through it. And that's where we then get into a lot of sticky points.
Yeah. And also, the whole fact that, the country was, sort of built on very racist and white supremacist ideals. The fact that, the land was taken, so the natives were dispossessed of a land that was theirs, and enslaved Africans were brought here to farm it, right? So the whole beginning of this American concept was built upon the disadvantage of another people's. And when you look at the question that the person who posed it is asking, why is it important? It's important because if you have structured advantage for 400 years based upon something that is not a fact, a biological fact, and we call it white and we call it black, and the only reason we call it that is so that we can justify the mistreatment of people, then that is a reason why belonging is so important. Black people can never be considered white. However, Italians and Irish and Jewish and other lighter pigmented people can, because they look similar. They look the same. They can be admitted into this white race. But when darker melanated people like myself, as soon as I enter the room, there is no mistaking the fact that someone different has just come in to the room, and therefore, based on that difference, based on that skin pigmentation, I would be omitted from belonging. I would not belong. I would not be able to join the group if it were based on race. And so that's why belonging is so very, very important. And the other reason, and the writer talks about, the heroes of that she identifies with because of her whiteness, right? Our Black people's heroes, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, those are people that you've probably never heard of, right? And if you did, you probably heard of Martin Luther King. But our heroes and heroines aren't, as embraced as, the Benjamin Franklins or the Thomas Jeffersons or others who are celebrated and given high status. And so to identify with them reinforces something within particularly young people in formative years where they begin to take on this same sort of socialization, and it brings them into this whole realm of belonging, and that is celebrated in American space.
So we have a comment, and then I'll ask Trustee Howell. She raised her hand to make a statement, but before we do, I'd like to acknowledge that our Chief of Police, John Costanzo, is here with us. So thank you to the Chief for joining us for this discussion. Comment made by Chris DeGiorgio: people are loved. We want to be loved. When someone feels left out, they feel less than. People want to feel welcomed. African Americans and other people who are perceived to be different are often left out. And that's Chris DeGiorgio. Trustee Howell, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that belongingness too, and again, how visual we are. And there's still so many ways that, I think there's a limit on who can belong to things, right? So I thought of an example of my daughter was in ballet for a long time, and that was when Misty Copeland was, her career was taking off, and just all the stories of, right, you didn't see Black ballet dancers, the kids who were in school trying to get there, like Misty Copeland, even the leotard colors, they would say, buy a flesh colored leotard. Well, you could get one if your flesh was white, but there's, people who had different skin colors would have to dye their leotards. I think about toys like baby dolls and Legos, and all of that is still predominantly one color. And so you see that all the time, and that kind of reinforces who belongs and who doesn't. So just a thought.
Right.
Any other comments, questions?
None?
But there don't seem to be any right now.
Wow, you guys are quiet. So
It's getting started, don't worry.
So she moves from belonging to this notion of freedom of movement, and many of us don't take any thought about how we move, how we how we live in the world. But she talks about her freedom of her movement has been without restriction. And for many of us, now I was a New Jersey State Trooper, and I can tell you that we had some very real profiles that we observed, and we were trained, and I emphasize the word trained, to look for certain types of individuals. And we were taught to be inventive in our policing so that we can pull those individuals over. And I'm an African-American male from the inner city, and I was trained to do those kinds of things, to restrict the movement of certain people, because certain people did not or were suspicious. Let me just say that. And so, and I know that there were people who did not fit the profile that we didn't look 2 glances at, because they weren't the typical person that we were looking for. And so in this society, because you're in a dominant group, you can move without restriction. does that touch anyone anywhere?
So someone says, Nancy Heitnort, I can understand how this book and the discussion of racism can be uncomfortable to discuss because it can open everything, unpen everything they believe. Someone else says, we have to acknowledge that our society makes white people inherently comfortable and makes people that are not white uncomfortable in most settings.
And I think we have to ask ourselves, or begin to ask ourselves, certain real humanizing questions, you know, when we realize that these sorts of practices and patterns happen. I think we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to make, you know, to ameliorate these sorts of issues? Because we, you know, hiding, you know, the issue under the rug, or putting our head in the sand and ignoring it, does not make the issues go away. And having excuses like, well, you know, we're just people, we just, you know, we're just doing the best we can. We have to realize that when we are considered African Americans or Asian Americans or Latino Americans, when we are a hyphenated American, we are automatically seen as less than a full American. Dr. Fraser, would you?
Yeah. Okay, and we have two more hands raised.
Okay.
Lori Gerald, and then Kara Cronin.
Hi, everyone. I have a perfect example of what you just described. You were basically talking about profiling, which we know is a thing in policing. And I will give you another example of what profiling might look like that I just actually experienced yesterday. So yesterday I had gone up to the Westchester Mall, and as I entered, there was an older white woman who was waiting for the elevator. And if you've been to Westchester Mall, the elevators are slow as molasses. So we were standing there. I was going to actually take the steps. And so she says to me, do you know where the Apple store is? So I said, oh yeah, it's actually on the 3rd floor. So I'm helping her. And she seemed very confused to me about where the store was. So, you know, I have just a heart for my seniors like that who may need some assistance. So she just seemed out of it. Like, so I'm trying to explain to her where to go, and up walks a man, a Black gentleman, and he's standing there. And so I'm trying to explain to her where it is. So he's just there minding his business. So the door opens up, and I said, well, you know what, I'll just ride up with you. I was going to take the stairs, but I'll ride up with you on the elevator so I can show you exactly where the Apple store is. So when the Black guy went to get onto the elevator, she was like, no, I don't want to go on the elevator with him. No one get on. And I'm thinking that she's talking about because of the coronavirus, maybe she didn't want to be on the elevator. So the elevator starts closing, and she's like, and she's trying to hold the elevator. And she says, I needed a man to help me with the elevator, because I don't know, maybe she thought it was going to close on her. So she wanted the guy to help her with the elevator. But then when he tried to go on, she says, no, I don't want you. She says, she looks at me and she says, you can come on, but he can't come on. And the guy looked at me, and I knew exactly what that was. She was afraid to be on the elevator with this Black guy. She was terrified that, you know, I don't know what she thought he was going to do. He was in there minding his business. He wasn't even thinking about her. And I came home and I was sharing that, Michael, right? Yeah, I told you about this just last night. And I have to tell you, when I realized what was going on, I was very angry about that, because I should have said something to her in that moment, but she was up there in age. I was just like, I was angry about it. And to the point that I considered getting off at the elevator and letting her figure out where the Apple store was. because that kind of stuff is ridiculous. And we had an experience with my husband, same type of thing. He was somewhere and he walked past this white woman and she grabbed her bag and held it like this in fear. And he said to me, he said, he said to the woman, "You really don't know how safe you are now," because he was a state trooper. He just didn't have on his uniform, but he's a state trooper. He was like all set, like, "Lady, you don't even," he said, "You really don't know how safe you are right now. That guy over there that I'm watching in plain clothes, that's the one that you probably should have been worried." He said he was thinking, "It's the one because that's the one I'm here surveilling right now, the white guy that's across the street." But she felt, perfect. She was not grabbing her back for that. So anyway, those are just some examples of what profiling looks like and what happens as a result of profiling.
Thank you. Kara?
Hi. I was just thinking about what Nancy had said, and like, these are very hard conversations to have, right? People don't want to talk about this. And it goes back to something we said last week, because we've been trained not to talk about race, not to talk about these issues. But what I thought was really interesting about like chapter 4 in particular is that Diangelo frames this whole thing about her life and then is very candid about the mistakes that she has made, right? She says, listen, this is a time I didn't walk into a party because I got scared because I thought I was going to be the only white person there. And this is a time where I didn't think about this. And this is another time. And I think there's a certain kind of liberation that happens when you start to acknowledge these moments where you feel free to move into spaces and other people may not, right? And so when you feel that sense of liberation, you can start to talk about race and racial issues in the United States a little bit more freely, and it becomes a little bit easier, I think, for everybody. This is a very hard thing to do, and I think we should give ourselves some space to acknowledge, like, this is hard, and that but there is a certain there's a certain calm that starts to come over you, and you become really almost free to talk more freely, to listen to people, to say, and then you have a space to say, okay, in this moment I acted like this and that wasn't cool and I'm really sorry about that. And hopefully then somebody will forgive you, or they can choose not to forgive you, but you can move on, right? Or they will not forgive you and they will move on with their life. But you start to move forward, you start to say, okay, I'm not gonna do this again. I'll try to do this. And maybe you start to listen a little bit better. And then it becomes a little less hard. So, I agree that, Nancy, like, these are really, really hard things for people to talk about, but I think that there's space for movement for sure.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge that our mayor has joined us, Greg Luisi. Welcome. Thank you for joining us, Greg. I think I'm trying to keep us in a good time space. So for Drs. Gerald and Frazier, would it be okay if we moved on to chapter 5? I'm trying to keep it half hour each chapter. I think we did a good job of discussing how race shapes the lives of white people. Chapter 5 talks about the good-bad binary and how we seem to form racism as in extremes. Either you're good or you're bad. If you either participate in racism or are racist towards someone, or not understanding the full scope of it. So maybe you guys could shed a little light on that.
Thank you. One of the most important things that she says, and it's kind of buried early into that chapter, is the idea of the good-bad frame is a false dichotomy. Mm-hmm. People, all people, doesn't matter where we come from, who we are, have prejudices. Mm-hmm. And so if we can look at that as a human quality or characteristic that we all have, then it takes away the silos and the separation that we create for different groupings of people. And, I think that, the dichotomy, even if you think about age, and the dichotomy between young people and the elderly, and, however you define that, it could be somebody over 40 for some, could, But it's that kind of, I think, critical thinking that gets muted when we're just looking at our reaction to and our protection of ourselves. And when we're trying to protect ourselves and perhaps say, I'm not a racist person, I'm not prejudiced, I love all people the same, it's impossible. Because we are human. And so then hiding from those realities doesn't allow us to really understand how we impact other people when we are then in a situation, for example, getting on an elevator and there's somebody there that makes us uncomfortable. And that may not be that it bothers anyone else, but it makes that person uncomfortable. And then, the reactions that come as a result of that. And for a person, there's a tendency, a great tendency, to be able to rationalize and justify that in themselves. And there's nothing anyone else can say to eliminate that, that emotion. So that, what's happening cognitively, intellectually, and what's happening emotionally and affectively are very key things that all people need to pay attention to. And again, you walk into a community or into a meeting or whatever the case may be, and you realize that whether it's gender, it's age, it's ethnicity or race, that you're different or everybody else is there that's similar and you stand out like a sore thumb or vice versa, those are the things that are important for us to begin to pay attention to. And I think it's one of the things that the author is really trying to help us, hone in on, is not the intellectual appreciation of, the information that's there, but how do we internalize that and how do we understand that as an individual, as a member of a community, as people that are in positions that have influence and can help educate others about what is true, what is just, and what is fair. And again, we vary on those things because of who we are as individuals and persons and our experiences. But if we don't do that, then we don't grow. And we're not part of the solution. We continue to be part of what I see as a, social, emotional, spiritual problem for us as people in a society, in this country in particular.
So there is a question. It says, Diangelo presents a litany of statements that fall into two categories that she terms as colorblind and color celebrate. Can you talk a little bit about what these categories mean? Why are the statements that she talks about so problematic?
Well, I think, and Michael, I don't mean to step over you, but I would say that in part, when I read that, and you go through the list, I was taught to treat everyone the same. And
Are you saying that that's one of the statements, not that you're saying that?
Right, but that was what I was told. When I was growing up, you don't treat people differently than yourself. You don't think you're better than them. You don't think you're smarter than them. And again, that's a very clear statement that's connected to, I think, values that we are all raised with, and some more than others. But the second one, I don't see color, is an affront. Just like you don't see gender. Well, of course you do. Of course we do. Why do you say that I don't see color, I just see the person? Well, the person is obviously who they are, right? My grandchildren pick on me all the time because my hair is not blonde anymore. It's turning a different color. And so that, creates the reality of talking about age and what happens, rather than hide from it or say that, that's not appropriate. You shouldn't talk to people about, they look old or they move slow. To engage in a conversation about that is a whole different reality. How does it feel? And I think, we go back to the example of the pier. Again, she uses an example in the last section that we were looking at, but the example of the pier, and you look at it and it looks like it's floating on the water, but it isn't. There are, these beams that are holding it into the ground
Right.
through the water.
Right.
And so, again, trying to get past that very flat, narrow perspective. And so that's why I think, the colorblind statements are powerful, but they're also very problematic for that reason.
Yeah, particularly we live in a time where we are celebrating people who are woke and who are allies to, Black Lives Matter and other protest groups, and yet people are still holding on to these statements of color blindness, and they consider themselves to be, really, really woke, and they think that these are expressions that are affirming, but really they invalidate, people of color, in many ways. It sort of makes you stand out in a whole different light. And, and the writer, I mean, this is a very difficult conversation because many of us have never really understood race in this way, that, race is not white people's issue. They just are, and so race really is those of us who are melanated. That's our issue. And so the burden falls on the minorities to many ways help, teach white persons how racism affects us. And really that's not our responsibility, right? So, so in many ways we have to really understand that. I think the writer is pointing these things out because at some point, if you haven't thought it, then you heard it, or you've been told it, and you haven't been aware of how dehumanizing these statements really are.
So Jessica asked a question. She says, you're talking about whole person, whole identity. How does the term intersectionality relate?
Dr. Frazier?
Well, I'm going to pick up on what you just said, Michael. Intersectionality, I believe, in one perspective, is how some of these different qualities and these different realities for individuals, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, age, there are the points where there's an intersection, there's a connection that happens. And the reality is that so many people are afraid to embrace that and to connect with someone that's different, but has the same experiences or the same realities, the same feelings, the similarities that create an intersection between two people that there wouldn't otherwise be. And how important it is for those kind of discussions, those kind of dialogues, to allow people to open the door and to get to know the other, in whomever and whatever that's about, so that we realize how much more we are similar than we are different. And that doesn't mean that we don't see the differences. We respect the differences. We learn from one another about those differences. And so the other is no longer an other. It is a part of my understanding of the bigger picture. But again, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to respond that way, and not everyone is going to appreciate that. And so that those intersections are not going to happen. That connection is lost. But I really think she is working, as I've gone through the book and watched her develop the content and the thought, that it really is about this ability to peel away the layers and to really get to a core that allows us to feel and to acknowledge things that perhaps have been very uncomfortable for many of us to own or to acknowledge at other points in our lives.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of intersectionality deals with, multiple disadvantages when people of distinct groups face, similar kinds of disadvantages, and the only reason that one would be experiencing this is because you're involved in that group, and so you have these commonalities that intersect, that come together based upon, disadvantage. So people in public housing, or people who are, who have, on welfare, they have multiple intersecting realities that keep them categorized in the same sort of grouping. And, that becomes almost an impervious kind of force, which they hardly ever rise out of that system because of these deep overlapping sort of, intersecting, realities. And so I think, that's a very good question. I don't know who asked that, but that's a very good question.
That was Jessica.
Good question, Jessica. But Dr. Fraser, I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you.
No, I think, to your point, you're right, because this, there's one piece here. She talks about cross-racial friendships do not block out the dynamic of racism in the society at large. And these dynamics continue unabated. The white person will still receive white privilege and the friend of color does not.
Right.
And again, that's a profound statement, and it's very true.
Yeah. It is.
Excuse me. I wanted to know, with all the things that are going on with the racism and all these constructs and things that have been formed, how do people form real relationships? Because I don't think that there could really be an equal relationship, because there's no shared power in the relationship. That's how can you form an equal friendship?
You mean equal friendship with a white
With
person?
another person, yeah, with another person, because there's no real honesty there, quite possibly, because Black people have probably, or people of color have been shielding, like she said, shielding their white friends from the true reality of what is said and what they see. And maybe the white person doesn't even understand how they are situated in the world.
So my response to that, as someone who's been an educator for a number of years and watched transformations happen, it's about the desire that an individual has and a willingness to peel off some of those layers of protection that we put on ourselves, so that what we're feeling, what we're thinking, what we don't know, and what we need to know becomes very apparent to ourselves, and our vulnerability to the other. And again, whether that's someone that is, Black or Latino or Asian, we are the one that controls how that happens for ourselves. And those are the conversations that we need to be having to be able to welcome and to open ourselves up, to learn and to embrace difference. The chapter 4, it was, it's all about, protecting ourselves as white people and white privilege. And I don't need to, deal with the crap that other people deal with, because I'm okay and I can get what I need, and that's what's important to me. But the reality is, I don't believe that's who we are as human beings meant to be. And that's my perspective. And so I have my whole life gone out of my way to befriend people and help educate and also be educated by them. I want to learn about what I don't know. I want to learn about the things that make me uncomfortable and try to understand why. Because it's not the other, it's me. All of those things are in us. But most of us are not really willing or conscious that we need to be willing to step into those experiences.
So Jessica also responded to Nancy's question. She says, transparency and honest conversation about the uncomfortable would be the how, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Scooter Scott asked a question. He said, upon what, besides emotional empiricism, is the assertion of privilege in an interracial friendship supported? Doctors? Upon what, besides?
Well, I think what would invalidate or validate the experience is how a person experiences the other. So I don't know that that's necessarily based on emotion, but if you constantly putting me down, or if you constantly ignoring me, or if you're constantly non-supportive, that indicates you're showing up in this relationship in a particular way, right? And that's not emotion. That's not being emotional. That's evidence based on action, right? And so I think we have to be people who are consistent, with one another, with our feelings, with our thoughts. We have to be thoughtful with our words, right, and our deeds, right? So I love the Bible. I am a preacher. The Bible says faith without works is dead, right? So you show me your faith, and I'll show you my works, right? So if I am a person who claims to be your friend, then I ought to evidence what true friendship looks like. I ought to go the next mile of the way, out of my way, or to be what you need for me to be, whenever you need a friend. And so I think that's, I don't think that that's emotional. I think that's just experiential, right? So in a pragmatic way, we have to just be willing to evidence what we claim. And I think that involves transparency. I think that involves honesty. I think that involves, on a real level, love, right? That's a word we haven't used, but I think that's what I think that's what you're driving at. And that she makes a remarkable statement in chapter 4, and I just want to highlight that, and then we can go to chapter 6 if you don't mind. She says on page 67 to 68, she said, I could live my entire life without a friend or loved one of color and not see that as a diminishment of my life. And that struck me because, I've often shared with, within African-American context, that very premise that, it's highly probable. And if you go to Montana, you go to other places, it's highly probable. You go to Idaho, she mentions that she wanted to go on vacation in Idaho, and that there's a neo-Nazi camp, right, where she wanted to vacation, and she was inviting one of her sister friends with her. And her sister friend said, girl, I ain't going to Idaho. Listen, we have to know that W.E.B. Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folks that Black people live with a dual consciousness, a double consciousness. Like, we have to know how to exist in the white world, but we have to also know how to exist in our world. But white folks don't ever have to know anything about our world. And I think when we begin to talk about interracial relationships and friendships. I think one of the most beautiful things you could ever do is learn the culture of your friend. And Dr. Frazier and I and Trustee Andino were talking, and we talked about, appreciating people through, one of the greatest ways through music and through food. And when you sit down and break bread with people, you are inviting them into your private space. And I think, barriers come down. I think you can have the prospects of a real meaningful, dialogue when, all of the defenses are down and you can just, relate to one another.
So Scooter Scott responds, and if you want to come off mute and speak, you're welcome to. He says, your answer presumes that my interracial friends act in a privileged way. They don't. And then prior to that, he said, but what about my many friendships where that does not occur? So I think that we're sort of ahead from where he responds.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
I would have raised my hand, but my camera's not working on my computer. That's why I had to chat in.
No problem.
I find a lot of the positions that the writer takes are more assertions rather than arguments. Arguments are a series of linked up ideas supported by demonstrable and observable situations, facts. And I use the term emotional empiricism because quite often we emotionally interpret something when that's not necessarily the case. One of my favorite examples was, I was reading about a gentleman who was on the subway and there was a family, father and 2 children. The children were acting a mess. And as the kids were acting a mess, this man is thinking, what is wrong with his father? Why isn't he disciplining his children? And after some time, an exchange comes up and the gentleman winds up having a conversation with that father. And he noticed that the father was kind of out of it. And he said, we're just, coming back from their mother's funeral. My point is, when we approach something with a certain perspective, we will often plug into as reasons based out of our emotions or biases, things that aren't true. And quite often I found in Diangelo's book, there are lots of those things, which is again, why I say emotional empiricism. She doesn't often use, for example, if I were to take as gospel what you just said about our inability to get over biases, then I would have to determine that every interracial marriage is inferior to a same-race marriage. And that's not true. The human beings in love are far more capable. It also denies a great deal of personal agency. So some of these questions, some of these things that come up, I just have problems either swallowing, I have problems digesting them as the result of good, impassioned, disciplined research versus, because a lot of these things are put forth in Ibram Kendi's books. And Kendi's books are basically a series of assertions with very little argumentative backing, very little to demonstrate the soundness of his ideas outside of pointing to things that can be interpreted as racism, but may have other reasons behind them.
Can I say something?
Feel free.
Hey, there's no more raising hands. It's just a free fall.
I'm not 100% familiar with it, but I do know that there exists a body of empirical literature that talks about power dynamics and interracial relationships. And so I think that there is some empirical evidence to support the idea. I am not 100% familiar.
You're referring to critical race theory. The majority of that stuff comes out of critical race theory, and that too is very popular on campuses. But yes, it is again, when you really look at the substance, critical race theory comes out of the Late 1800s, early 1900s, when you have the result of the critical political theories that came out of Eastern Europe. That is where
Correct.
critical race theory comes from. All right. So again, we have assertions, not arguments, based on constructs that look to place upon systems rather than people responsibility for their actions. And to go back to Martin Luther King and the kind of race-free society that he spoke about, envisioned, it had all to do with personal agency. It all had very little to do, though he would refer to systemic racism. He referred to the fact that, and at the time of Dr. King, we did still have vestiges of systemic racism. We did still have Jim Crow. Those things don't exist now. We have.
Are you serious?
Yes,
are you serious?
Still exist.
I am dead serious.
Hold on.
Where do you live?
Yes.
Did you see George Floyd? What was that?
That was a person. That was a
that was the
horrible
result
person.
of.
How did the system force that cop to put his knee on George Floyd's neck?
Oh,
That was a decision by a man.
So
Okay, hold on. We're not gonna have free for all anymore. So please raise your hand or type in a question, because we can go on forever about this.
Yeah.
And I do want us to get to other chapters. I do welcome, differing opinions, but we're at 8 o'clock and we have to keep people on task to chapter 6.
Yeah.
But this is a good discussion to have and to continue. And probably after we're finished with these chapters, maybe we can have another forum where we could talk more broadly, about other topics, if that's okay with you guys.
It's fine with me.
Yeah.
And I think his the young man's name it escapes me, but his comment, his statements, frame what I think Ta-Nehisi Coates's quotation is in chapter 6, and it opens up chapter 6. And I'll read it for us if you don't have the book. It says, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial injustice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. And for me, anti-Black forces have always committed violence against the Black body. And that violence was intended to destroy and to annihilate, or to at least bring into compliance, Black peoples, bring them under control in some way. If you think about the chattel slavery, the chains, the whips, was deployed to keep Black people in a subservient way. And even while they were toiling, right, they were still being called lazy, shiftless, good for nothing. But they would work from sun up to sundown. And so in some way, that structure still exists to this day, to this very moment. And we are still bearing the vestiges of that white supremacy even today. And so it shows up, in ways that the writer, who is a trained a trainer in racial space, she I think she comes to this work with a body of knowledge based upon her experience and based upon her workshops and lectures that she's given and over time. And so I don't think that this is an emotional or sentimental kind of work. I think this is a well-researched, well developed treatise, and I think that she does she lays it out, and it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for me to even talk about this stuff with folks. So I can only imagine it being uncomfortable.
Jessica typed in great intro to how systemic racism exists, a long history of evidence, and she puts a link there if anyone would like to see it. So are we going to go on to chapter 6?
Yeah, we're
That
in
was
chapter 6
it.
now.
Thank you.
So,
I'm just going to remind everybody to please mute unless you're speaking, just so we don't hear any outside interference. Thank you.
Dr. Frazier, you want to?
I'm just digesting everything that just happened. Thank you very much. One of the things she starts out with in chapter 6 is this, again, this reality of there are very specific ways that different groups experience racism. So much of that, you can take some of the common denominators, but then also some of the qualities or characteristics that make groups unique. And obviously, white is right, and black is back, and that's a very old statement, but it's something that in understanding racism, and we paradigm that black to white, but there's also the Asian, Latino, Indian. There's so many ways that this gets played out in life today. We, I think, as a country, have the kind of history that keeps us very focused on, the dichotomy between the black and the white. But again, the layers that we are confronted with when we think about what she talks about in terms of anti-blackness, and having that blackness is essential for us to have this sense of our white identity. So considering the programs that have been put in place probably since the 50s, 60s, that have evolved, continue to evolve, but have not yet been successful in creating the kind of change that needs to happen, that's not just political, it's not just policy, it's the individual, the community, the behaviors, a willingness to embrace the other. And again, we're talking about, white fragility. And again, whether that's with Black neighbors or Asian or you name it, I think that white fragility is, the key to opening our communities to be communities that are open to the other. And that happens, one person at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one community at a time, one organization at a time. And I think, what's happening right now, what we're doing right now in the community of Tuckahoe and, the broader other, Bronxville and Eastchester, I think is the kind of thing that we need to be doing more of, having these kind of dialogues, expressing our thoughts and our questions and our ideas, and the research that goes beyond one author to many other authors, so that we are all educating ourselves. But I have to say, it cannot just be an intellectual exercise. We have to allow ourselves, and I'll say that as a white woman, to be uncomfortable. And for me, when that happened for me years ago, I realized how changed I was. And that was not just, an intellectual process. That was an emotional, that was a spiritual, it's a very deeply personal reality for me. And not everybody has the opportunity to have those experiences. So doing this kind of thing brings it to the forefront and causes us to think more about it, to be more willing to make this personal rather than it's political or it's policy or it's somebody else's problem. And I anti-Blackness, what is that? I don't quite understand this concept, because Blackness is, and anti intonates that there's something wrong with that, and not any more than there's anything wrong with anti-white, anti-Asian, fill in the blanks. And as educated people and people who are, in positions, I think, in this community, that people listen to us, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to continue to educate ourselves and encourage others to do the same.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I just think that we this is a very difficult subject, and Nancy Height, made that obvious and to us tonight. And it makes us squeamish, to really talk about, these issues, but it's undeniable when you see the stratification of society, and when you see the arrangement of our system, in which brown and black people are on the bottom rung of the ladder perpetually. That's you can measure that. That's quantifiable. You can go into any city, and you can tell where the minority area is, and you can tell where the better affluent areas are. From New York to LA to Texas, Florida, you can really see it show up, and it's that dramatic. And so, in order for us to really have a conversation about this topic, we have to be willing to make some admissions that there is structural racism that has shown up, where certain people derive an advantage and other people are disadvantaged by the same system, and that's just the truth. And in this particular chapter 6, she gets at it through the whole notion of affirmative action, and how the myth is that since the 60s, Black people have been getting all of these hookups because of her affirmative action, when in fact affirmative action only applies to federally funded positions. And so in private businesses, you don't see a whole bunch of Black folks on corporate boards, because affirmative action has no real teeth there. So there's real measurable ways that we can see what this author is talking about show up in our own lives, in our own times. And so that's just something that I wanted to offer up there, for this discussion.
I have a couple more comments, and then we have someone who raised his hand, Chris DeGiorgio. We have 15 minutes left. So Scooter Scott says, regarding the link that Jessica put up, I can link all kinds, we disagree. I can link all kinds of things that dispute systemic racism. The officer acted out of his disregard for the humanity of George Floyd. Unless you heard some confession that I did not hear, you are presuming that he expected that the system would cover him. It didn't. So how does that prove systemic racism? And he goes on to say that he does agree that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a good writer. Renee also stated, the system has covered many for a long time. What happened to George Floyd was a turning point, one where people of all colors recognize that we cannot let the system operate this way. And we have a comment by Chris DeGiorgio. You can speak now, unmute yourself.
Yes, I just want to say how appreciative I am that we have this forum. And I would just like to share two experiences that and what this book is doing for me is it's giving me awarenesses of my behavior. And I think when we get into this theory stuff that we've gotten into, that's fine. But I think the better energy that we can work towards in our discussion is the aha moments of, have I had internalized racism in myself? For example, this past Sunday, I'll share an experience. I was driving on Central Avenue when I hit the Chase Bank to deposit some money. I had some money in my pocket and I wanted to deposit it. And I went into the ATM. The ATM was closed for whatever reason. They couldn't accept my money. So I walk out of there. I get into my car and I see a Black person walking by my car. And my immediate reaction was, did I lock my car? And I realized, I said, wait a second, here's some internal racism that's showing up with me. I think those are the things I think this book kind of makes us stop and realize, and we can say to ourselves, okay, this is not me, though it was me. It showed that, yeah, there are times where I'll just have that reaction. And I think that's something I hope this book really makes us think. And there's another situation happening in my life where I'm being silent and I'm seeing some racism going on, and I'm working in a structure that I'm in where I'm seeing some racism, and how am I reacting? How can I be an ally here because I'm seeing it? I mean, these are the things I think, I hope as we read this book, we can ask ourselves these questions. Like, if you, you know, I was just on YouTube and they were talking about the Supreme Stop in the Name of Love. I mean, I think that's a great thing. Stop in the name of love. I mean, it was about something else, but it is about stopping in the name of love. It is about stopping ourselves from our normal reactions and being honest with ourselves when things show up.
Thank you.
So it is 8:19 now. You want to give some final comments, and then we can close out so that we could be on time, about 10 more minutes.
One of the things I just want to point out, if anybody did not get towards the end of the last chapter, chapter 6, or is it 7, the anti-Blackness, where she talks about and uses as an example, the end of chapter 6, on page 96, she talks about The Blind Side, that movie. And I would imagine many people have seen it. And, you know, the kinds of things that make it a very touching movie to some, as you step back and, you know, look at it again, there are so many ways that, you know, subtle limitations that one places on an individual because of their circumstance or because of their race. And not that helping isn't a good thing, but it's, you know, being patronizing as opposed to encouraging and supporting and teaching and allowing for someone to become who they naturally are, without feeling like they can't do that of their own accord. And as I read that part of you know, what Robin wrote, I thought, this is an example of something that kind of just flew over my head. You know, I didn't really pay much attention. It's one of those kind of feel-good movies, but the messages that it sends and the reality that it perpetuates subconsciously is concerning. And I'm sure there are many, many others that one could, identify. I don't do a lot of movie watching, so I'm not very, good at, using examples. But there's one I have to say it because it just popped into my head. Is one from the mid to late '60s, "To Sir with Love" with Sidney Poitier. That, and again, I guess because it's education and, that's my life, it just rung in just every fiber of my being, that this person was, trying to teach difficult adolescents, and how race played a role in, how he was accepted and how he was able to do what he did as a teacher. But often looking at those things and over time seeing the changes that have happened in film, in movies that send a different message than they used to. And again, we're a long way away from where we need to be, but certainly that dynamic has changed over the years. And I know, thinking about, what is a movie rated and do we let our children watch it, as opposed to watching the movie and finding out, the messages that are subtle, and being prepared to talk about those so that, we're not condoning or ignoring perhaps some of the very crucial messages that come through movie, video, sitcoms, you name it. We need to be talking about that. Not judging, and certainly not critiquing in, critical ways that are not appropriate for us to do, but to have conversations about it. And to be honest about, I was insulted by this, or this really, bothered me. And those are the kind of things we need to be doing as a community, as families, to continue to explore and to deepen our appreciation and understanding of this whole dynamic of white fragility, of racism, the dichotomy that exists between human beings. And we're hearing it now already, with the Democratic vice president, nominee in the last 24 hours since, that was, on TV last night. I've heard more, and it's just disheartening.
Yeah, you raise a very good point, and I just want to say that it takes skill and it takes certain courage to have these conversations, and this is not a debate. This is a conversation. We're not trying to win anyone to any particular side. We're just having a conversation about the issue. And I just believe that, we are living in a time where people are, dealing with issues of nostalgia. And it's come up in our, political lives and reality, make America great again. It has given permission to certain elements to, that America isn't great with Black leadership. And to talk about anti-Blackness is to really understand that, there are forces in this world that are committed to being just against any person of color, to be, in constant opposition and obstruction of any progress that Black people make, because the thought is that if Black people are gaining ground, then white people must be losing. Mm. And so it's always this sort of, construct of, what is it costing me to have someone else live in my neighborhood or possibly date my daughter, or possibly, get a position that I'm going for. So the calculation is always in terms of, a zero-sum game and gain. And so I think that we have to, continue to have these conversations and to continue to really be willing to be vulnerable, and not that I'm right or anyone else is wrong. It's that, the only thing that we want is for us to have the conversation, hear one another. And if nothing changes, nothing changes. I'm in the faith business. So I believe that we have many conversions throughout our lives. And as my mother used to always say, if everyone else is going crazy around you, and you keep your head, then God is directing you in the path that you should go. So I just pray that we can get through the book and people can appreciate what we're trying to do in beginning this conversation. And I hope that there's some social and emotional growth that will happen as a result.
Thank you. We do have one final quick comment, and then we'll close out. Daryl?
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Just a quick comment on systemic racism, because there's this back and forth of whether it's real or whether people believe it exists. So systemic racism, also known as institutional racism, is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within society or an organization. It can lead to such issues as discrimination in criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. That's Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to close out. I also want to thank everyone who's contributed to the discussion. Marge just said, thanks so much to the presenters and those who spoke. Kudos to the library for holding the space for this discussion. I also want to reiterate what Reverend Dr. Gerald said, that this is a conversation. I want us to come together and learn and have differing viewpoints, but we're not debating. We're here. Everyone that's come to the session knows the book that's being read and discussed, so we know that. And I want everyone to feel safe giving their viewpoints, but also know that we're not going to debate in this forum. That might be for a different forum if people want. But I just want to thank the library, who is always so willing to just, stay late, work hard to support the village. And so I want to acknowledge the director of the library, Swadish Pashnanda, and Elaine and Kaiti, who just helped to put this together. And they're on now, I think, helping to manage the Zoom and to record and then post. So thank you, ladies, very much. I also want to thank the village board, people who attended on the board, the mayor, Greg Luisi, trustees Renee Howell and Gina Lee, for taking time out of their schedules to also be with us. It lets us know that the board wants to be a part of this and wants to bring the village together. And also the chief of police, John Costanzo, who is also with us. I appreciate that he came and sat in and listened. It's important for your government and your police department to hear how you're feeling and what you're thinking about things. It helps us to govern better. And I also want to thank the participants, everyone who contributed. I appreciate that you came and that you made yourself vulnerable in some cases, and that you were courageous enough to make comments that maybe others didn't agree with, and that's okay too. That's why we are a democracy. So thank you. I will turn it over to Elaine. Is that who's here? Or Kaiti?
Yeah, thank you so much, Omayra. Thank you. This was, again, a wonderful program, a wonderful dialogue, so important. And I did want to remind you that last week's program is on YouTube. We'll be sending it out in the newsletter tomorrow, and it will be put up on our website. And this will also follow by next week. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you so much, Dr. Gerald and Dr. Frazier, for your insight. Everybody have a good evening. Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Mhm.